Good evening and welcome to the season finale of Bond-tober. When I was doing pre-production on this particular season, I had actually listed this episode as the second to last, with the top 10 James Bond films coming here today on Halloween. But I decided it's more fun on Halloween to talk about the actors inhibiting a role. Therefore I switched orders, and here's our season finale talking about the best James Bond actors. George Lazenby. Now, I know that I've heaped a lot of praise on George, and while he does give a good performance, he doesn't give the best performance. This was his first acting in a feature film. He had done some acting as a male model, particularly for the Fry Chocolates commercials. But I think they saw in him a physicality and virility that would make for a very good James Bond after the abrupt departure of Sean Connery. Now, with that being said, there's a lot of things behind the scenes that kind of did a detriment to George's performance. One was the decision to have actor George Baker loop his voice of him impersonating his character of Sir Hilary Bray. It is very noticeable, and frankly, with early dubbing at the time, there wasn't much of an emphasis on delivering the emotion of the performance, but rather you have to fit the actor's voice flaps. And unfortunately, that does get dragged out for a long time, and I could have easily seen this part not done, and I think it would have worked just fine. Another couple things, too, is some of his lines aren't particularly as witty as Sean's. I mean, there are some very good lines in there, like this one.
Is anything the matter, Sir Hilary?
Just a slight stiffness coming on.
Oh, my.
But there are others like this one that aren't too great.
He's bronzed up.
But I think what makes him a particularly strong James Bond is the fact that he is very physical. He was 29 at the time of filming, and he was able to perform most of his own stunts, which was a far cry from Sean Connery, who relied mostly on Bob Simmons or Peter Perkins to do his stunts for him. Now, I think George really does capture the tender, vulnerable side of James Bond in a way that a lot of the actors don't seem to. Particularly with his love of Tracy, I think he really does sell the romance of it. And I do think that if he didn't work at all, as some people like to say, then the movie would have fallen flat on its face. And according to a lot of fans, it does. But for me, it really does take off from George, and everything else about it just builds up to support him. In the final scene, he is at his absolute best, both at the wedding and in the scene in the car. I think he really does capture the joy of being married, looking forward to a future, and having it taken away from him and us at the same time. And what was said was George had the book with him in the cockpit of the car in between takes, and he would read the passages of Fleming, just as Peter Hunt did in the director's chair, to get the emotion going. And he's just brilliant.
There's no hurry, you see. We have all the time in the world.
But even brilliant stuff like that isn't enough to save him, and he is at the bottom of the list because, well, he is the one-time James Bond. We never got to see him do more and do variations on the character or grow too much as an actor. So he's at the bottom, but not necessarily the worst. He's just the least. Now, on to the next. Roger Moore. Before y'all kill me, I know that there are a lot of Roger Moore stands out there. I know a lot of people like to say that he's the best James Bond. I get it. I understand. There's just too much of an inconsistent note for me that I get from Roger every time I watch him. I think just because the films and the scripts were very inconsistent in quality and kind of up and down, which made for kind of a frustrating experience when I marathon these films, because it would go from a good performance in Live and Let Die to a dreadful performance in The Man with the Golden Gun. Spy Who Loved Me was his pinnacle. I think he was at his absolute very best as James Bond, and he seemed to play him more straight in those films than the others, where there's kind of a flippancy and a coolness to him that kind of makes him detached from the viewer. Now, I understand that that could be seen as a plus, because James Bond as an agent should be more or less a detached personality. But Fleming was very careful to make him interesting. I think Roger sometimes is a little too dry for me, especially for Your Eyes Only onto A View to a Kill. I think he kind of fell back onto some old tricks and was very averse to taking risks, particularly that story on the setup for Your Eyes Only, where he got into a shouting match with John Glenn because he wanted him to do a particularly cold moment right out of the pages of Fleming, whereas Roger didn't want to do it because he had established his Bond would never do such a thing. So there is a little bit of a thread of compromise throughout the rest of his films, which I think really hurt his reputation for me as James Bond. Now, Roger was a lovely man in real life. I was thrilled to see that he was a very generous, kind, upstanding gentleman. He was a goodwill ambassador for UNICEF. You know, he's a class act, and I think he did bring a little bit of that to James Bond, which I do appreciate. Believe me, I do. But it's, like I said, that inconsistency of writing and performing that just really kind of makes his era, even though it was the longest and most influential, it seems, in terms of the film and Bond community, it just never did much for me, and he's lower on the list because of that. But he did pass away, and I was very sad to hear it. I was very sad. And so I will toast Roger. You know, no hard feelings to you. You are special for a reason. Pierce Brosnan. I think Pierce is the most unfairly bashed of the James Bond actors. I think, again, much like Roger Moore, I think that comes down to the quality of the scripts. He seemed to yo-yo from 2 good movies to a decent movie to a bad movie. Now, like I said, I have a fondness for Die Another Day, and I always enjoy watching it, but I do recognize its faults. Now, with Pierce, what seems to be the Achilles heel for a lot of people was kind of what I feel about Roger Moore, is Pierce kind of brings a little bit of a too cool for school kind of attitude. He's a little too icy in his portrayal, even when he's trying to be funny, his light voice seems to belie the joke, or it seems to belie the drama of the situation, should there be any. But he was kind of the Bond of my childhood, and I thought, going back watching these films again, is it going to be nostalgia goggles doing this for me? Am I just putting him over because I just personally grew up with him? Well, thanks to GoldenEye, Tomorrow Never Dies, and even his performance in The World Is Not Enough, I think he is a very solid James Bond. He's great physically, he is very good looking, and I do like sometimes his too cool for school attitude. I think that very much fit in the 90s aesthetic. And I do like that he is self-aware of his shortcomings, and he's self-aware of the production, particularly that clip of him discussing Die Another Day. The kite surfing scene is just priceless.
Right, Brosnan, we're going to do kite surfing. Tsunamis today. Kite surfing, a tsunami. Oh.
Great Scott! Even you know it!
Oh, that's so good. You know, but again, I think Pierce is underrated, and I think if you go back and look at GoldenEye, Tomorrow Never Dies, and The World Is Not Enough, you'll find that he was actually very much on the right track. I think Die Another Day kind of did him in. It did him no favors in terms of character development. There was too much CGI, which didn't really give him a chance to show off his still formidable physical prowess. And so I feel bad that he ended on a bad note, just as Roger and Sean had done before him. But Pierce is still a very good James Bond, in my opinion. Timothy Dalton. I'll admit, when I first saw The Living Daylights when I was a kid, I thought Timothy was a little weird. And as I discussed in my episode talking about The Living Daylights, I think it was because there was still a hangover period from Roger, which was an emphasis on jokes as well as action and some hints at darker elements. But I think what made Timothy brilliant was his absolute commitment to Fleming. He was adamant to Cubby Broccoli and Michael Wilson that he would not just follow in Roger's footsteps. I think if they had asked him to, he said he would have turned them down flat, no matter the money, no matter how highly he thought of them. And I think this clip that I used in the episode as well perfectly encapsulates his feelings about Bond and why I hold him in such high esteem when others don't quite do the same.
What makes these movies work? What is it that got them going? You've got to go back to the beginning. Here was a hero who murdered in cold blood. The dirtiest, toughest, meanest, nastiest, brutalist hero we'd ever seen.
I think that perfectly sums up Timothy's absolute best elements as James, especially when it comes to License to Kill, which is his best performance as Bond. He really embraces that gritty, rough, and tumble nature of Bond. And he also kind of, he does inject a little bit of humor, but it's more sly and it feels more natural. Like the scene when he captures the seaplane full of money and he sees it and he just kind of gives a little giggle to himself. I like that he's not serious to the point where he's not having fun. It shows that there is a humanity to James, and especially his relationship with Felix Leiter in that film, and that he would go on a revenge bent and throw MI6 to the wind, which makes for a very unpredictable story. And I think, and also Tim's absolute commitment to doing most of his own stunts in both films is just marvelous. And I appreciate that it's not bravado, it's a commitment, because this man is a Shakespearean actor. He's a god among theater actors, that he's so committed that he would do this. He would say, strap me to the top of a truck going at 60 to 70 miles per hour because I will hold on and I will deliver the stunt. It's not an ego thing. It's more of a love for the character and a push to make the films better. And I think after that last stretch of Roger Moore, he really helped bring Bond up a notch. The public just wasn't ready for it, and I can understand why. Especially after having Roger for over 10 years, it was a little bit of a shock to the system and something that the public wasn't ready for, or as Marty McFly said.
I guess you guys aren't ready for that yet. But your kids are gonna love it.
Daniel Craig. What else can I say about Daniel Craig that hasn't really been said? I mean, we've had him since Casino Royale, and he just hit the ground running with Casino Royale. He took that description that Ian Fleming had used, that Bond is a blunt instrument, and they put it both in the screenplay. And I think Daniel was thinking of that line all throughout production, because he just roars right out of the gate. He is physical, he is mean, he's tough, and he's dogged. And I love that he has a complete disregard for the rules when it comes to hitting his target. I think that was a new kind of mix for James Bond to have, because all the James Bonds have been loyal to M. They'd broken the rules a little bit, but not too far, except for maybe License to Kill. But this one, he's perfectly willing to bend the rules to get what he wants. And in Quantum of Solace, there's not much growth there, even though they tried to force it terribly with several scenes with M. Skyfall is where I think he reached his peak once again as Bond. He really introduces this element that if Bond felt screwed over by the government, that he probably would go into hiding. He would probably leave. In later films, I think they abused that, both in Spectre and No Time to Die. But I do enjoy that Daniel does get to act with a capital A. in these films, because I feel like a lot of the other actors outside of Dalton felt a little bit, and Connery, felt a little constricted, like they were being held back a little bit, whereas I think Campbell and Mendes and Cary Fukunaga really encouraged Daniel to find new things about this character without losing the essence of the character, which I think is very important these days. Is a lot of films recently, in terms of reinvention, are trying to go so far away from a certain performance or a certain perspective or image of the character. I think Daniel finds just the right balance between Fleming and a modern Bond who's a little more vulnerable, who has a little bit more of a heart. Now, I don't agree necessarily with all of his choices in the later films, like The Decision to Die and him trying to be Roger Moore in Spectre. I thought they were kind of detriments to what he had established. But I think there is tangible evidence that he could be seen in future generations as the best James Bond, even trying to supersede Connery. Now, as you see in my order, that's not quite the case. But Daniel Craig really did encapsulate James Bond, and until we find a new actor, and I know he retired, but until we find a new actor, he kind of is James Bond. I think he really did his homework and he delivered the goods. He really did a splendid job.
Bond. James Bond.
Oh, y'all knew this was going to be number one. I mean, who else would it be? Sean Connery not only hit the ground running, he hit the ground at a sprint. He perfectly is James Bond. He has the virility, he has the brutal element of Fleming. He's charming, he's sardonic. He's a little bit sadistic too, which I think a lot of the Bonds have tried to back off from because, 60s mentalities are not quite seen in such a positive light anymore, and many of them rightly so. But I think the reason why Sean is so beloved is he just effortlessly plays his character in the first couple of films. He really is that guy. You would look at him and you think, there's something unique about this guy. You can't put your finger on it, but there's something there. There's a spark there. And as we see through his progression as Bond, he does seem to find new things, and they really were trying to find new things for him to do until about Thunderball, when things started to kind of change with his relationship with Saltzman and Broccoli, him being tired of the continuous production of these films and wanting to do different things. But when he left the series on a decent note with You Only Live Twice, but not a good one. His performance was very half and half, and I think you could tell which scenes were filmed when, because when he has energy and spunk, that's early on in the production, and when he's bored and tired and monotone, you could tell that that's very late. And the less said about Diamonds Are Forever, the better, but according to that film, he was very happy to be back. The problem was they were filming in Vegas, and so he was up all night, right into shooting, and which is why he looks tired and haggard. But it doesn't do anything to sully his reputation with me, and it doesn't do anything to sully the brilliant work he did. He just is James Bond. He will always be. A lot of people like to say, oh, well, the first actor's the best actor. That's not always the case. But this is one of those cases where that's absolutely true. Because he just understood the assignment and he went for it, and it's just aces. And so, with that being said, Sean is the best James Bond. In fact, You Only Live Twice's publicity department kind of did their job for me. As you can see in this poster, he is James Bond. And that wraps it up this season for Bond-tober. I'm glad you guys came on this journey with me once again. If you guys have ideas of your own for what I should do next year, or if there's certain opinions of mine that you didn't like, leave it in the comments. I will read it and I will respond. If not, tough turkey. But until next year, happy Halloween. I'm Jim Crowley. This is Bond-tober.